Okay, good evening, dear colleagues, dear friends. I am very happy to welcome everybody at the continuation of our Armed Democracy program series. And today's event, I am also very thankful for joining in to Tamara, Hundorova and Serhiy Yekelchyk. Very grateful that you kindly agreed to take part in this series. My name is Vasyl Cherepanyn. I represent the Visual Culture Research Center and the Kyiv Biennial. And before we start, foremost, I would like to, again, traditionally, to express my deep thankfulness to the Ukrainian military. It's only because thanks to them that we are privileged enough here in Ukraine to sit here and have the possibility to conduct these interesting talks. Without them, this practically wouldn't be simply possible. And this Armed Democracy series, which will be run until the end of this week, has been conceived by the Kyiv Biennial and Biennale Warsaw from the East Europe Biennial Alliance, and it is being conducted within the second edition of the Warsaw Biennial that is taking place these days till mid-July. So for those in Warsaw or in general in Poland, I encourage everybody to visit the beautiful biennial location. And I also have to say that this series is just the first part of the longest series of events organized by the East Europe Biennial Alliance. So after this part, other events will follow in Prague within the second edition of the Prague Biennial, then later in Kassel within the Documenta 15, thanks to Biennale Budapest, and then in Riga within the Survival Kit Festival in September. So we will have a kind of extended series of events dedicated to discussing the Russia's military invasion of Ukraine over the summer and fall of 2022. A technical note to our audience, this event is live streamed on the Warsaw Biennial Facebook page and YouTube channel. So for those, our listeners and viewers who are watching us, please, you are encouraged to leave your comments and questions on the Facebook chat or YouTube chat. I will then try to voice them to our speakers tonight after their respective presentations. So again, I am very helpful to welcome Professor Tamara Hundorova and Professor Serhiy Yekelchyk. Today's event is titled Ukrainian Culture and War, at War. And I think we have actually Ukrainian speakers tonight, and I find this extremely important, especially to the audience, with regards to the audience outside Ukraine at the moment, since for many reasons, because it's basically one of the perhaps most important urgencies that because of which this program series was somehow conceived, was that the specificity of this Russian-Ukrainian war, which is being conducted by the aggressor, not just against the Ukrainian military, but exactly against the Ukrainian population and the Ukrainian cultural identity in this sense. As we heard in late February, that we were supposed not to exist in somebody's psychotic mind. But practically and also infrastructurally speaking, I think this topic requires a profound analysis also because as we've already experienced in the recent months, that so far we have more than, if I'm not mistaken, 400 cultural sites and museums deliberately destroyed by the Russian military, which somehow is a kind of an vanguard force of the Russian cultural colonialism. But also like speaking on behalf of the Kyiv Biennial, in the very first days of this full-scale invasion, we also launched an emergency support initiative, which is aimed at constant support of various cultural workers, artists, different varieties of practitioners, but also art emergency residencies, which we have at the moment, mostly in the west of the country. So I think this is also a very important aspect that we can tackle within this debate today, because we somehow faced this somehow unthinkable situation that we are at the moment on the wreckages of the cultural field as we knew it before, also in sociological sense, because most of the people representing the field were displaced or have already left the country. So it's also a very kind of unexpected and problematic moment that we find ourselves in. So my pleasure to welcome and introduce our speakers tonight. Let me start with Tamara Hundorova, who is the head of the Department of Literary Theory at the Institute of Literature of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Then she is also an associate fellow at Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and the dean at the Ukrainian Free University. And in Munich, she is an author of numerous books, including the Post-Chernobyl Library, the Ukrainian Postmodernism of the 90s of 2019, Transit Culture, Symptoms of Post-Colonial Trauma of 2013, which I think will be also in the focus today, and many others, numerous publications on modernism, feminism, post-colonial studies, and history of Ukrainian literature. Professor Hundorova also taught at Harvard University, Toronto University, Greifswald University, University of Kyiv-Mohyla Academy, which is also my alma mater. And she was also a former Fulbright scholar, visiting scholar of Monash University in Australia, a recipient of Yekelchyk Distinguished Fellowship, and many other fellowship, and she has, of course, many teaching experiences as well. And Professor Serhiy Yekelchyk received his PhD from the University of Alberta, and he is the author of 7 books on modern Ukrainian history and Russian-Ukrainian relations. I also would name here the award-winning book, Stalin's Citizens, Everyday Politics in the Wake of Total War, of 2014, and he's a professor of history and Slavic studies at the University of Victoria, and currently he's the president of the Canadian Association for Ukrainian Studies. So I think we start with the presentation by Professor Tamara Hundorova, which will be dedicated to the post-Soviet Ukrainian generation and the challenge of decolonization that this generation has been constantly facing. And somehow this is especially interesting for me personally as well as institutionally, since it's not only just because I represent this generation as well, but also because everything that has been organized in Kyiv and elsewhere internationally by our institutions and many partners abroad has been somehow an attempt to tackle those challenges that I believe Tamara will touch on. So thank you so much again for joining us today. The floor is yours. Sorry, you are muted now. Could you please unmute yourself? Yeah, now it works. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Vasyl, for the invitation to join this event and to participate in this Biennale, this very interesting, very important cultural forum. And also, it's a pleasure for me in order to be today with you and to to speak about the subject that it seems to me is quite interesting when we are talking about the cultural situation today, or when we are look at the history of contemporary Ukraine. And I would like to talk today about the generation, about the gap of generations, and I will start just to try to outline a kind of some prehistory of my talk, especially starting from the 1990s, especially. But because it seems to me it is very important to keep in mind this evolution of post-Soviet generation as well. It is known that generation make history in the same way as history make generation, and how contemporary Ukrainian literature, contemporary Ukrainian history is made by generation is very well testified by the Ukrainian literature during the last time, during the period of independence, as well as today, because the topic of parents and children and generation gap became one of the central to their discourse. I just would like to mention just a few of such texts that are dealing with this problem of generation. First of all, I recall, of course, Оксана Забушко, Музей покинутих секретів, or as the writer herself called it, a family saga, which revolves around the history of three generations. In 2004 was published Maria Matthews' novel Солодка Darusia, that also is dealing with the past history, past parents, and how it reflects on the fate of the next generation. But it is also the subject of her and constructive subject of multinational history of Bukovina in her novel Panorama Bukova Zemlya, that represent a history of 200 of years in Bukovina. The overcoming of transgressional trauma caused by history and restoration of lost cultural and national memory is depicted in Sofia Andruchovich's novel Amadoka. I also would like to say something about Evgenia Kononenko's Nostalgia, where the parents' history puzzles the children by the secret of the past Soviet time. Volodymyr Lysov, in his novel Century of Yakiv, Stolitya Yakova, connect the life of a young asocial and drug-addicted girl to the fate of old Yakiv, who also reveal his story and his story of his family as well. Of course, Lina Kostenko's novel Записки украинского сумасшедшего also depicted this kind of catastrophic vision of Ukraine seen through the lens of different generation. And of course, Serhiy Zhadan and his novel Porosholovgrad and especially Internat present the vision of this process of maturing of a young individual, young man who was born in the time of the Soviet Union, but whose years passed over during 1990s, and he was also traumatized by some kind of infantilism. So I would like also to mention that numerous of anthologies of Ukrainian authors was published starting from the 1990s, and they all testify the intent of to self-identification within the generation identity. And this is 80-ники, 90-ники, 2000-ники, позадесятники, and so on, there's many others. So to understand it seems to me, role of generation is one of a very important historical phenomenon, means that we we take into consideration the generation in their connection with the most important historical change, like the process of colonial expansion or resistance, or the neocolonialism or post-colonial globalization as well. In contemporary Ukrainian literature, I would say that this subject of generation since 1990s was developing primarily in two aspects. One of them is the narrative to narrate the generation gap, and the other was the idea of restoration of great narrative of family history and to inscribe it into the history of Ukrainian nation. And both are penetrated by a phenomenon, by idea of post-colonial memory, because such a post-colonial rewriting of history usually tend to reveal the traumatic core, and it often turns generation into the main agents of this of traumatic experience. I would like to mention, for instance, the Museum of Abandoned Secret by Oksana Zabushko, because it was one of the first that I would like maybe open this kind of new interest to the family saga, and after that the novels by Sofia Andruchovich or Maria Matios or Makhno, Vasyl Makhno appears, and all of these texts are dealing with this family saga and represent different generation in reaction to the history. Actually, Oksana Zabushko was a kind of transgenerational gap that was forced by totalitarian machine, and that ruined, devoured entire generation. It is one of predisposition of the main conflict, of the main subject in the novel, but Zabushko's idea was aimed at something more, and to write a kind of post-colonial novel of recovering and bridging the generational gap. Here time is associated with the labyrinth that links all generations together. I quote, for instance, "We all are rubbing elbows in the time without even realizing this, those dead, those alive, and those yet unborn." It reminds, of course, Shevchenko's idea of this kind of mystical, maybe unity or national unity. In such a way, like roundabout wheel of returning brings together the people separated by years, generation, and even centuries. And what is also very important, that post-totalitarian period of transition demonstrate a kind of alienation from the Soviet past, but not from all the generation, or like Oksana Zabushko, who actually started the problem of re-evaluation of Ukrainian Шестидесятники. And she depicts very interesting character of a so-called weak father who belonged to the generation of Шестидесятники, and who is actually destroyed by the fear of arrest, and brings in his psychology, in his mind, this trauma. But also this post-totalitarian trauma also hit not only the Soviet older generation who grew up under socialism, and whose crisis in 1990s brings them to the re-evaluation of or reassessment of their values. But however, post-totalitarian trauma also affect young people and children who did not experience, or experience only partially, the influence of the Soviet time. This trauma gives rise to feeling of uncertainty and instability, and severs familiar connection between parents and children, and destroying one's sense of historical continuity, and prompting dissociate behavior and resentment. This transgenerational trauma is intensify feeling of defenselessness and emotional disturbance. And as Carmen Heim asserts, I quote his citation, his word, skeptical or destructive analytical thinking is likely to be found among the members of generation that had gone through radical changes in the realm of power. And Serhiy Zhadan's works clearly demonstrated one of the central subject, one of the central topics of his work is the identity of his own generation, which he calls the last Soviet generation. I would say it is not a lost generation, as we know, as we call the post-war first generation. Nevertheless, they were also lost in some sense of spiritual alienation from the values of their father as well. The traumatic juvenile subjectivity of post-totalitarian time is perhaps reflected most strongly in Zhadan's poetry of the 1990s. Zhadan character experienced this time the period of homelessness. The country that was born, he was born in, did not exist, and alienation and feeling of homelessness lead to never-ending journey and prolongs a loss of faith in the world of adult, who themselves lack root in the new life. The archetypical images of this generation in Zhadan's text are teenager. This teenager does not want to grow up. He does not want to grow old, since the word of adults or his fathers becomes associated with failure and deception. And he has a very, I like this citation, this verse by Zhadan, old age is always a failure. This is not even a loss, rather a possessing of something that quickly lost its value. Step by step, the scaffolding of the South is rotting and falling. The lining is whitening, the bridge bearing are bending, the velvet on the carcass of the hot hut is being torn. Actually, this Zhadan teenager perceives himself as a world without a father and without a home, associates himself with a road and look for their kind amount of the homelessness, migrant and former hippies. Actually, they also aspire to live apart from history, as one of them in Zhadan's Depeche Mode confesses, I quote, "Damn, it is so annoying. I mean, when I realized that it turned out that someone lived before me, and unlike me, that person had a real life, ate breakfast, had sex, maybe even loved somebody, shopped at the market and stores." It is so. I would say that Zhadan became not only the leader, but his work became a kind of manifesto of this generation. And actually, what is also very interesting is his last work, Zhadan, consolidates this generational biography by tracing the transformation of homeless adolescent into mature men who eventually return home to protect their women in their final territory, as Zhadan called it. The story of this teenager who coming of age in a post-Soviet world, and it is very interesting in contemporary, in the context of contemporary Ukraine, in contemporary war in Ukraine, because this generation became the hero and fighter in war. Zhadan for instance, represent three types of generation in his latest novel, The Orphanage. That is a story about war in Donbass. This novel was published in 2017, and primarily it is he depicts three generations. Primarily, it is an aging father associated with Homo Sovieticus, a totally inactive senior whose worldview shrunk to the images of a constantly flickering TV. Pasha, his 30-year-old son, the school teacher who tries to be a political and impartial observer amidst the war. He does not want to ground himself in life and just goes with the flow. There is another character, Sasha, Pasha's nephew, a teenager who lives in an orphanage close to the front line. The Orphanage is a road novel. The story unfolds around Pasha's journey to the front line to bring his nephew home. Metaphorically, it reveals Pasha's inner transformation, actually is maybe in his initiation, who in fact still reminds us the teenager whom Serhiy Zhadan was speaking of in his poetry in 1990s and the beginning of 2000. During the journey, Pasha is forced to take on a role of a guide, solve complex issue, and take responsibility, no matter how hard he tries to avoid it. He has experienced a series of trials, but that put him in the position to take a side, thus becoming mature and responsible. One can perceive such a journey as a rite de passage, a situation that signifies various changes related to the circle of human life, and as birth, coming of age, marriage, and death. Pasha enters into the real adult male life, but paradoxically, the one who serves as his mentor, the one who guides him into adulthood, is not, of course, his father, whom he believed in absolutely, who lost his authority, who became a kind of bankrupt, but teenager Sasha, his nephew. And this is how Zhadan finalized the story of the last Soviet generation. Pasha is comparable with a teenager in the early work of Zhadan, a teenager who does not want and cannot grow up in a constant escape from reality. Thus, his naturality and infantility are the product of transgenerational colonial trauma inherited from his father. Not without reason, Pasha's right hand is injured. He cannot fight because of his physical disability. In fact, Pasha has symbolically stuck in the state of an eternal teenager and is only able to reproduce the infantilized weak form of traumatized identity. However, Zhadan breaks the hereditary line stretching from the Soviet time, and nephew Sasha who represents the next generation, the one that grew up in the days of the independence, plays the role of a symbolic father who leads Pasha home through trials, not only introducing him to the adulthood, but also bringing him to the stage of contemporary history. In a way, Sasha and Pasha as a mirror images. This dualism can be interpreted as an attempt of integral, subconscious recreation of identity traumatized and hauled into by the colonial culture. In the last pages of the novel, The Orphanage, Zhadan gives the word to Sasha, who, unlike Pasha, knows which side he takes since the beginning. Sasha belonged to the generation of independence, and he is not traumatized by the colonial Soviet imperial colonization and also infantility. And also, he also does not have a home. He was sent to an orphanage, has no father, and does not claim to be a hero. He understands that he has to take on a historical responsibility and obligation. Isn't it this generation of independence that we associate today with Roman Ratushny and his fellow that Russia is waging war against today, trying to destroy it physically and erasing its history? Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you so much. Especially for this mentioning, who used to be also my friend. I'm happy also to pass on the microphone to Serhiy Yekelchyk, who will focus more on the current modern, more so to say, digital culture and the cultural logic of the symbols of resistance to Russian aggression in the mass Ukrainian culture of today. Thank you so much, Serhy, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation. And it's always a pleasure to be speaking at the same forum with Tamara Hundorova, who's a long-term colleague and friend. Tamara. I hope things are all right in Europe. Here in North America, we are, like Ukrainians everywhere, involved in the rethinking of the cultural field. And this rethinking of the cultural field is based on some things that are basically familiar to those working in the humanities and social sciences. But others are quite new. And in order to appreciate the new and the old, we need to take a look at what is in fact happening in the Ukrainian cultural sphere now. Some roots of this process have been indicated very nicely in Professor Hundorova's talk. It's a generational thing. We are fighting the same battles, or at least this is how many writers see it. And these battles basically bring us to the same points of taking a decision, of going left, going right, going center, but basically deciding who the friends are and the enemies are, which means, of course, deciding about your own identity. And that's the essence of Ukrainian identity struggles in recent decades. It's important to understand, of course, that Russia did not become the essential other of Ukraine overnight on February 24th this year. The trajectories of Russia and Ukraine politically diverged early on in the early 1990s, if we are speaking about independence, and of course one could argue for a much longer history of diverging cultural trajectories. But essentially, while Ukraine was building democracy in a chaotic and sometimes very corrupt way, which was precisely the way Russia wanted these developments represented, Russia was building autocracy, was building an authoritarian regime, which included a prominent component of resentment, of nostalgia for the empire, and the lack of clear identification as a nation state. It's an important point, often missing in our discussions, is that we sometimes call the Soviet Union the empire. And of course, we also speak of Russia today as an empire. But the important point would be that neither of them really processed the notion of empire fully. Only the Soviet Union started doing it in the 1920s on a limited time frame. And then, of course, went back to the notion of the empire in the 1930s under Stalin. So the unprocessed imperial consciousness, the unprocessed trauma of being an empire but never really becoming an independent nation, then defined the cultural field for Russia in the decades after independence. And then, of course, Ukraine ended up being part and parcel of this process because whether Ukrainians wanted it or not, they constituted an important symbol in the Russian cultural space. And that meant that we are basically in dialogue with Russia. We are stuck in this dialogue, and it's time for Ukraine to actually define things in a clear way. And we have seen some suggestions that perhaps were problematic coming from some prominent Western and Ukrainian colleagues, such as claiming the Ukrainian Russian language from Russia and making it the Ukrainian Russian. But of course, what caused most discussion in Ukraine and abroad was, in fact, the battle over memory, which started in 2014-2015, and in which eventually Ukraine found its footing. But in the early stages of that battle, the first move was actually made by Russia, and that was the legislation prohibiting the blackening of the Great Patriotic War. And then the Ukrainian parallel response, which came in the form of decommunization legislation in 2015. And at that point, some colleagues, including myself actually, felt that this is basically a good thing and the fundamentally thing that needed to happen. The only problem is Putin is not a member of the Politburo of the Central Committee. So if he claims that all the evil is basically from Lenin, then we find ourselves agreeing with Mr. Putin, because he also feels that all the evil is fundamentally from Lenin and Marx. So in the Russian cultural sphere, Lenin and Marx are Europeans, quote unquote. They are the predecessors of the West, who destroyed intentionally the great Russian Empire. What this meant was, of course, not that decommunization was not necessary. It was in a variety of ways, but that it was incomplete by definition from the very start. And that became clear early on for those people working in the field, for those colleagues at the Institute of National Memory, whose work I was following closely, because very soon they found themselves dealing with monuments to Suvorov, streets named after Kutuzov, monument to Empress Catherine II, and other such things, which clearly were increasingly less and less connected to the notion of getting rid of communism. Some of them could be connected to it because Tchaikovsky, of course, also served as an important symbol of Russian cultural domination, which is part of present-day discussions. And it was introduced, especially in post-war Soviet Union, as such. So when dealing with the legacy of Tchaikovsky in Ukraine, we are actually dealing with the legacy of the post-war Soviet Union in this way. But soon it became clear that, you know, Catherine II cannot possibly be a Soviet hero. And there were other cases in which it became increasingly clear that the Soviet imperial ideology was larger and on some occasions opposite to what was represented as the legacy of communism in Ukraine. And that was the moment when some of us tried, and I have tried as well, among the voices of Western scholars, to argue that the important notion we need to introduce here is the notion of decolonization. This notion of decolonization is central to the work of my colleague Tamara, Hundorova, and many others. And it is very well understood by our Western interlocutors. When we speak about decolonization, they know exactly what it is. And there are very clear parallels between the way decolonization is understood in North America and in parts of Europe, and the way it is understood in Ukraine. Moreover, decolonization abroad often involved destroying the monuments. And those statues coming down were not always to the colonial leaders, but rather cultural symbols of something we now understand as imperial domination. And that builds a number of parallels with the Ukrainian case. And let's not forget, of course, that we are still in dialogue with Mr. Putin's Russia, whether we want it or not. So every move in the Ukrainian spheres of memory and culture is going to be commented on by the Russian press and represented in a certain way. And of course, we all know about the rebuilding of Lenin monuments in Ukraine, in the occupied parts, temporarily occupied parts of Ukraine. What do we make of it? We know perfectly well that Lenin is not Mr. Putin's hero. But of course, the meaning of Lenin in those occupied territories is different. It is a symbol of the Soviet past, which is rethought as unity with the Russian people. So that is the reason for the Russian troops and pro-Russian political figures installed as puppets in those regions to rebuild Lenin monuments. Trying to do this in Russia wouldn't bring them much success. Mr. Putin's hero is, of course, General Anton Denikin, the leader of the White Armies in the Russian Civil War, and not Lenin. And yet in Ukrainian territories temporarily occupied by the Russian forces, this is what is happening there. And what does it tell us about the cultural field? That the cultural symbols are constantly in dialogue with each other, with the nations and communities which build them and destroy them. And in fact, by destroying Lenin monuments, as symbols of the Soviet past. Ukrainians, during the Revolution of Dignity, made them important to Russia and pro-Russian forces. And so this forced dialogue, which is forced upon Ukraine, is going to continue. And it's time for us to take a quick look at the most current developments, to what kind of responses it generates in mass culture and official culture in Ukraine. And the good place to start would be, of course, the concept of the patriotic war, which became introduced in the Ukrainian official discourse early on during the conflict. And it's based on a very recognizable Soviet concept of Отечественная or Vitchiznyana in Ukrainian Vina, which was the Soviet way of referring to Second World War. And also before that, it was the Russian Empire's way of referring to the 1812 war against Napoleon. And so what could potentially be the reason to bring back this term into the Ukrainian mass culture? Very clearly, the assumption behind it is that many Ukrainians, in terms of cultural system of coordinates and historical memory, remain Soviet people. That must be it. In fact, it was very clearly expressed by one of the two people introducing this term. The first was Vitaly Portnikov, a prominent journalist, who didn't elaborate on it. He just started using it as a title for his video blogs, beginning with the first day of the war. And following that, the term, which is now patriotic war, became widely used in Ukrainian mass communications. But the person who tried to justify and think through the use of this term was actually my colleague, historian Yaroslav Hrytsak, writing for a popular magazine. He actually said that that precisely is the reason that people aren't familiar with the concept of a patriotic war. And it would be an opportunity to mobilize for the current conflict those who still have what he called a family memory, the powerful family memory of a patriotic war. And of course, Yaroslav realized, as any good historian would, that by doing so, he would need somehow to establish the difference between the current Ukrainian understanding of Vitchiznyana Vina, patriotic war, and the Soviet one. And in order to balance this, he also said that while we do accept this term, we don't accept the notion of narod or narodna vina, because that's the Soviet notion, which refers to the unorganized population, which is easy to manipulate. And instead of narod or narodna, Ukrainian journalists and historians and political commentators should switch to using the nation. And on that occasion, he also said that President Zelensky's party would do well by renaming itself from servant of the people to leaders of the nation. So, and in this way, it became clear to all observers that, in fact, there are issues with adopting Soviet terminology because it comes complete with the connotations of these cultural symbols. We cannot just take it out from the Soviet context and drop it into a new Ukrainian context and expect it to do well in this respect. So you would need to constantly limit its use. And in fact, this is precisely what happened. The attempt failed. Even so, President Zelensky started using the term Vitchiznyana Vina together, by the way, with Narodna. So in this way, he was being even more Soviet than he was allowed to be by Yaroslav Hrytsak and Vitaly Portnikov. Neither term became prominent in mass culture. They were basically left in the official discourse, and even in the official discourse, they increasingly disappear. So what then did remain? So what remained was the notion of genocide, which was not introduced by the state, but introduced very early on social media and had a history of popular mobilization around it. And that was, of course, the campaign to recognize the Holodomor, the man-made Ukrainian famine of 1932-33, as a genocide. And so that notion was picked up by the state from social media and made a successful device of defining what exactly Russia was doing in Ukraine. So that was one way of answering this question. But it would be, and of course, that notion is precisely un-Soviet. It was not prominent in the Soviet discourse at all. It actually represents the post-Soviet Ukrainian consciousness, and in particular, it is read as a reference to the Holodomor, and of course, the Holodomor is the genocide of Ukrainians in the hands of the Soviet state. So there is a very clear and interesting parallel there. There were other proposals, and none of them really became successful. Volodymyr Vyatrovich, the parliamentarian and former director of the Institute of National Memory, argued that Vyzvolna Vayna would be the good one. And of course, Vyzvolna has resonance both with the Soviet mythologies, historical. The Vyzvolna Vayna would be Bogdan Khmelnytsky's rebellion in Soviet parlance, but also Vyzvolna Vayna resonates with the concept of nationalno-vyzvolnie zmagання, struggle for national liberation, which was widely used in diaspora and now transferred into the official discourse in Ukraine, and many of my colleagues, historians, are using it. So that term too was used occasionally by official figures in Ukraine and functioned on social media as well, but again, didn't win. And of course, there was also a contribution by my colleague from the United States, Yurko Shevchuk from Columbia University, the instructor in Ukrainian language there, who reacted to this by saying that the very term Vitchizna or Vitchiznyana was compromised because of the way the Soviets used it, because in Soviet usage, Vitchizna referred to the larger entity than Ukraine. It was, in fact, implicitly the Soviet Union which was behind Vitchizna. One can argue with that. It was also true to, in effect, to a degree, of the Ukrainian term Batkivshchina, which is yet another term for motherland or fatherland, but nobody proposes to dismiss that term either. So the genocide really became the one which is seen as pro-Western and which is also seen as a powerful symbol of Ukrainian sufferings in the hands of imperial master. And then, of course, totally new terms were introduced. One would notice the continued use of occupante and zaharbniki, both of them translating as occupiers, both of them also traced back to World War II, or the Great Patriotic War in this particular case. But the new term Russism, meaning Russian fascism, originated in the public sphere. But the state smartly and quickly embraced it, to the point even of the Parliamentary Committee on Humanitarian and Information Policies calling upon the world media to adopt this term. President Zelensky publicly predicted that the term Russism will be in future history textbooks around the world. And my colleague Timothy Snyder introduced it to the Western audience and explained its meaning to the global readership in his article for the New York Times Magazine. Now, the other way of referring to the war or conceptualizing the war culturally was, of course, naming the enemy. The traditional derogatory designation of ethnic Russians as Katsapy or Moskali was revived and widely used, but on social media and in fact in mainstream media very often as well, it can be only used in semi-encrypted forms because there are rules on major social networks against using it. Then the term Rusnya made it and became prominent, originally introduced during the Chechen wars, based allegedly on the Chechen term for dirty or filthy, borrowed from thus a history of liberational struggles by a different group. But then something came up which basically became by far the most popular way of referring to the Russian occupiers, And that was, of course, the orcs from J.R.R. Tolkien's saga, The Lord of the Rings. References to Russia as Mordor appeared on Ukrainian social media early on after the start of the Donbas War in 2014. It took several years for the term orcs to come to the use in mass media, but then, especially after the all-out Russian invasion in February 2022, it became universally recognized and used in official publications, widely used by Ukrainian officials as well. But interestingly enough, there was soon a pushback on the part of Ukrainian intellectuals against the use of this term. Some journalists and public figures argued that precisely naming the enemy would be the good start of a struggle against the enemy. Some of them referred in this respect to a different phenomenon of popular culture, namely the Harry Potter series and J.K. Rowling's novels that are behind this series. Because, of course, Lord Voldemort is known early on in these novels and films as a person who cannot be named, and the struggle against him begins precisely by naming him. So in a way, referring to the Russian Federation and the Russian army as the orcs was one way of not assigning responsibility, or perhaps removing the responsibility from Russia and Russians. And this position too became widespread on Ukrainian social media and the op-ed columns written by Ukrainian journalists and public figures. Then, of course, we move into the field of popular culture and look at the interaction between the state and mass culture. There are examples of the state starting on a note which is very familiar. For instance, the reintroduction of the notion of hero cities, in this case, initially hero cities, period, and later renamed the hero cities of Ukraine, based on the Soviet precedent and acknowledged as such by President Zelensky, quote unquote, this is the way it was in the past, when we defeated another but similar invasion. But then, of course, the state looks at the society's reaction, and the reaction of society was highly mixed. First of all, it feels like we are actually fighting against the legacy of the Soviet Union in many ways, and that is in fact true. So reintroducing the Soviet language and Soviet designations raises questions of whether we use the same cities as hero cities. For instance, Kiev, as well as Odessa and Sevastopol, were hero cities in the Soviet Union. So should we make Kiev the hero city in Ukraine as well? So it would have two distinctions as hero city and two golden stars on its coat of arms. So the approach then became different, and Ukrainian hero cities were very often not the large centers, but the smaller ones, which were crucial for fighting during the Russian occupation, such as, of course, Bucha and Hostomel and Irpin. But then again, the reaction on social media was that perhaps it would be better to call these cities not in a Soviet way, but in a new way, cities of heroes, which would make the population of these cities, the defenders of these cities, heroes, not the cities themselves. And this opinion, originally expressed on social media, wasn't picked up by the Ukrainian armed forces and the Minister of Defense and used by the state. And that, I think, illustrates something very important about the way governments function in the age of computerized mass culture, the virtual age, and in particular, President Zelensky's administration functions, because it is very sensitive to how it is perceived on mass media. And very often you would see president's reaction the day after something comes up on social media and is widely shared. Then he shows up the next day to comment on this and adjust the government policies. And also they play games with media in a variety of ways. So if a hero city was a no-go, then what would work? And that would, of course, be the relatively new phenomenon of informal permission on using obscenities in both the official discourse and widely on social media. And that was, of course, the case of the Russian warship. The saga of the Russian warship has not ended yet because we don't know the author of this meme, or mem as they call it in Ukrainian. Because initially the public was told by the mass media that the Ukrainian infantryman Roman Hribov was the author of that phrase, that he was the one broadcasting it on radio in response to the Russian warship. But now, of course, that was undermined by the media and by the claim of Ukrainian border guards that only the border guards had access to the radio, and it was in fact a different person who cannot be named. That somehow this sounds familiar here, and means the death of the author. This person is possibly, potentially a prisoner of war held in Russia, but it also means that the author does not really matter. And the story itself also doesn't really matter, because the story was introduced as a story of the people who heroically died, each and every of them on the island, which turned out not to be the case. But at that point, the Ukrainian society actually welcomed the fact that these people were alive, because they were the heroes, and they were the symbols of something important, of this meme, Russian warship, go yourself, which became so prominent that 2 stamps were issued, one with the slogan itself, and the second one after the warship in question actually went down. Now, of course, a similar dynamic, or somewhat similar dynamic culturally, can be observed in the case of Доброго вечора, ми з України, good evening, we are from Ukraine. Originally, it was a single from the Ukrainian electronic music duo Probas and Hardy, but the phrase really became famous after its use by a popular and charismatic governor of Mykolaiv Oblast, the ethnic Korean Vitaly Kim, who started using it in his daily video addresses. And then it became the symbol of Ukrainian resistance, and then it became the subject of the third postal stamp, which illustrated this phrase with the Ukrainian tractor towing a Russian tank, yet another visual symbol of inventive underdog defense, basically. And then, of course, there is a Saint Javelin, in which my colleagues from Canada are involved, because it was an idea, the idea basically taken from a popular American artist, from the Kalashnikov Madonna painting, designed for Ukrainian-Canadian charity by Ukrainian-Canadian artist, with the aim of supporting the veterans and families of the fallen, but then appearing everywhere on murals. And the murals, of course, create controversy with various church organizations, T-shirts and stickers and such, and the Minister of Defense wearing Saint Javelin chevron on his upper left sleeve. And then my last point would be that while some of these cultural references are explicitly modern and reflect an uneasy engagement between global popular culture and the traditional ideas of commemoration and glorification that are usually traced to World War II, there is also an entire line of symbols that reaffirm the value of traditional Ukrainian culture. And that's fairly important too. Palyanice is one of them, the traditional round sourdough bread, which the Ukrainian media started recommended early on as a pronunciation test for suspected Russian infiltration, because Russians, unless they grew up in Ukraine, cannot pronounce a soft ts. So that underscored the importance of language, which is a very appropriate development in fight against the enemy who is denying the very existence of the Ukrainian nation. The sudden popularity of Batko Nash Bandera, our father Bandera, yes, another sign. And of course, it's often presented as the old song from the 1940s, but in reality, it is a very modern product, which is skillfully shaped in the cultural form of an old Ukrainian insurgent song. And more recently, of course, there was also this ceramic rooster and the kitchen cabinets that withstood the impact of the rocket and were subsequently taken to the museum, became a symbol of holding on, of continuing to fight. And the rooster now is a subject of an exhibit, a museum exhibit, which brings back to life the entire history of Ukrainian faience industry and ceramic industry, going back to the 1920s and before that, but essentially most importantly to the 1960s. So some of these symbols underscore the importance of Ukrainian culture and force the readership and the social media audience to look back at Ukrainian culture. And that's actually a very interesting development. Not going to talk about Patron the dog, also there is some interesting thing here. The Phantom of Kiev basically illustrated the government's failure to manage an important cultural symbol created on social media. And an important one to mention is, of course, the memes making fun of Alexei Arestovich, the Speaker of the Office of the President, who is charismatic, but a little bit too much aware of his charisma, and also projecting optimism a bit too much. And the number of cultural memes on social media portray somebody asking Arestovich for something which cannot possibly be known. And Arestovich always answering, oh, 1 or 2 weeks maximum, which is his trademark phrase. And so that already indicated the resistance to the government playing information games as well. And finally, there is actually a good example of the agency of Ukrainian soldiers who are skilled in using social media and manage to control their image in Ukrainian mass culture. And that's the case of Azovstal. The Azov regiment and other paratroopers and others fighting inside the Azovstal steel mill in Mariupol, who did preserve until the very last moment the control over the media representations. And in fact, the withdrawal, the final withdrawal from Azovstal was not announced by the government, but rather actually announced on Telegram by the commander of the regiment. And only then the general staff issued a confirmation saying that they have fulfilled their duty and the mission is now over. So these are all examples of different cultural trends of why things happen, why they happen the way they do, whether you can recover agency, and how the state is trying to control it and trying to basically borrow from social media the already successful symbols, but sometimes manages to destroy successful symbols such as the Phantom of Kiev and such. And it also means we are in a very different war, and it's not enough to say it's a hybrid war. It's a hybrid war in which much mobilization happens on social media. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Serhy. And yeah, thank you, Tamara. Just a short reminder to our viewers that I'm encouraging you to leave your comments or questions to our speakers on YouTube chat or on Facebook page, and I will also bring them into the spotlight later. So to start our conversation, I think that would be also a question to both of you, because I think it also touches those issues that Tamara covered with regard to the kind of literature perspective and the evolution of these ideas in the writings by different Ukrainian authors after the crash of the Soviet Union, as well as with regards to these new warfare mass cultural developments. But this is really a general question, but I'm still like struggling, because it seems like what even you described are also kind of examples and like overview of different processes, which in general can be perhaps defined as some search for a proper language in a way. And I'm curious here with regards to this idea or a notion, or rather a concept or a set of concepts connected to colonialism and post-colonialism. So we have this kind of concept of you Serhy mentioned decolonization, right? But we also have post-colonialism. We also have anti-colonialism, right? But as we all know, all these discourses, respectively, had been developed in a way with regards to the experiences of the West European maritime empires, right? Somehow. Of course, they were then afterwards they were somehow updated to fit to other realities. But in origin, they rather refer to traditional European colonialism. And at the same time, we are dealing, when we refer to our immediate past, we also have this kind of overlapping of post-Sovietness, post-communism, and post-socialism, right? So, I mean, it's also kind of an, in a way, also somehow we can also perhaps legitimately can use this term hybridity in this regard, right? Because we are not, it seems still are not quite sure what we are trying to decommunize or delegitimize in this sense from the past, and what are the right words that we have to embrace in order to describe this properly, in order not to fall into the trap that you described with regards to Putin and his thoughts on Lenin. So how would you frame this decolonial or post-colonial? What is the proper way to deal with this decolonial discourse in our current realities before the war and especially in the context of war? Yeah, perhaps Tamara, as you were first. Sorry, could you please unmute yourself?
Thank you. Actually, it seems to me this is one of the main questions when we are talking about the current situation and about decolonization. It seems to me today, and especially in Ukraine during this war, we can observe some kind of a changing the whole concept of post-colonial studies, it seems to me, or we see this a very intensive changing of discourse from post-colonial to decolonial or decolonization. And in some way, for instance, Marco Pavlyshin, whom you of course know, Serhy, especially, you know that we both were in Australia in Monash with Marco Pavlyshin. He, in one of his work, he tried to state that post-colonial ideas, post-colonial resistance, I would say, can be developing in the frame of postmodernism. So this is a kind of a soft traditional, soft attempt to subvert the imperial symbols and history, just to inscribe in this general imperial culture the existence, the history, the language, the culture of the oppressed nation, for instance. And this kind of legalization, I would say, in some way is a kind of a fiction or maybe utopia, because for instance, when we look at the contemporary situation in Ukraine, we see that with such a country like Russia, for instance, who didn't overcome any imperial consciousness, and on the contrary, it developed it celebrated, and it's have a kind of nostalgia for the big country, big imperial past. So it is very hard to imagine that the connections, some kind of dialogue can be taken in the frame of such kind of loyal discourse or dialogue. Because as we see, the dialogue cannot exist. And now when for instance, some Western intellectual even some Russian who does not accept this invasion into Ukraine, they call for the dialogue. But we all know that the dialogue it's impossible because we are in an absolutely different position. And to start the dialogue, it should be taken the process of decolonization in the Russia itself, and decolonization of the Russian culture as well. Just to be conscious and just to reveal and to deconstruct, I would say, the kind of imperial meaning, imperial symbol, imperial messages, character, and so on that were inscribed in Russian culture, in Russian history as well. What we have today in Ukraine is this process of decolonization. This is absolutely another strategy, the strategy of to break and to be self-conscious and not to orient and not to be oriented to the dialogue, to the reversal somebody, or because it's meant that you are linked to the other, to this big other, I would say. But you have to create, you have to open your own possibility, your own history that has its own meaning and its own sense. So it seems to me this is what Serhy, it's a brilliant examination, analysis of different level of this strategy of decolonization that that we have on the level of language, or creating of language, or reappropriation some concept from the past, like a patriotic war, for instance, or the idea of to take in how reinterpret the idea of Misto hero, for instance, like this. So this strategy is very interesting because it seems to we are witnessing a kind of creation of a new image, of a new language that has not only common usual usage, but also it's a kind of new methodology how we can interpret the war like we have today, like a hybrid war, and how we can pass from post-colonial to decolonial consciousness. It seems to me it is very, very important. And when we analyze such many levels of this creation of a new consciousness, that help us to overcome the colonial trauma, generational trauma, the trauma of not being visible in the culture, not being named in the culture, for instance. All of this strategy, it seems to me very interesting, and it seems to me this is also a kind of front line in contemporary academic society to try to deconstruct, to understand the way of decolonization that we are now witnessing in Ukrainian society, in Ukrainian as well, mass media as well.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with Tamara on that. And I think the understanding of decolonization that now exists in the West, even in the Western mass culture and public debates and the mainstream media, is much wider than the original precedent of having the empires in continental Europe and having colonies elsewhere. There is now the definition which goes beyond the notions of difference in a traditional way, which is usually based on race. Ireland is now being analyzed as a case of colonial policies and decolonization. In Ireland and Scotland, of course, a number of universities now have bilingual websites in order to stress the importance of language. Languages are coming back here in Canada as well. Efforts are being made to bring back the Aboriginal languages which have been defunct for some time. So that emphasis, for instance, on the recovery of Ukrainian culture and the construction of something which is seen as true Ukrainian identity, also it's always a provisional construct, as we understand. that emphasis is very well understood in the West, because we are far beyond the notion of European metropole and colony in what is now the third world. I think the issues of discrimination against women are understood as well in a way which is very similar to the notion of colonial hierarchy. So ultimately, we are dealing with cultural and social hierarchies and using the instrument of post-colonial theory and decolonial drive in order to undermine these cultural and social hierarchies. So that is very well understood. And of course, this is also the way Western societies treat social difference now, pointing out that the systemic privileges for those who are wealthy and systemic disadvantages for those who are seen as poor and culturally inferior to the culturally superior wealthy people. So I think the very concept of post-colonialism and anti-colonialism became rethought and are widely applied now in Western mass culture. And I find it actually quite surprising too. Also, I shouldn't be, especially in recent years after the Black Lives Matter and with protests in the United States during the last week concerning the overturning Roe against Wade legislation. You see that these social movements are essentially adopting a similar language, and that's the language of prejudice. And that's what the empire is really all about prejudice, cultural and social. And then the drive, which we would previously see as narrow and nativistic drive to restore the language, the rights of the language, to restore dignity. That is very much part of present-day Western understanding of getting rid of imperial legacies. And so the Ukrainian case fits in very well. And I have to say that the revolution of dignity, now that this term became really widely accepted, is also yet another thing which explains nicely and in a neat conceptual way to the Western readers what it is really all about, that people need to recover their agency and dignity, and that's, you cannot possibly have one without the other. So you have to recover your agency not from a colonial state as such, but from the state which uses the strategies, the cultural strategies and political strategies taken from the imperial experience, from the state which oriented itself towards Russian authoritarianism. So I think the wider cultural understanding of overturning hierarchies and recovering agency really influenced our present-day notion of what decolonization is. Of course, an important footnote, and the one which I was also trying to introduce in the Ukrainian debates early on, with the suggestion that decolonization would be more appropriate in many ways than decommunization, is also that one can instrumentalize the notion of decolonization. And the extreme case of instrumentalizing it would be to say that we are not responsible for whatever was happening in our history because we have been a colony. And that, of course, is not the case. So decolonization has to come with critical awareness of how the Ukrainian elites were helping build the Russian Empire, and how, and actually that would nicely explain why one of Russian strategies was to create separatist republics, why Russia was able to find for its project those eager to collaborate. So that it's not the history, it's not only the history of heroic resistance to the empire, it also is a history of accommodation, participation in imperial drives, or even the history, as scholars argue in more recent days, the history of refusing to select a community, kind of intentional neutral identity, not identifying with Ukrainian patriots, but not identifying with the empire either, just refusing to take a stand. So decolonization is an important tool, but it needs to come with critical awareness of our own role in history and culture.
Yeah, indeed. But also, you know, in this regard, it reminds me somehow, should we somehow take into account the responsibility of the humanities as such, and the discourse of post-coloniality, at least in the way how it was practiced after the crash of the Soviet Union, because like what Tamara was also referring to, like these kind of emotional, affectual conditions of instability, defenseless, resentment, uncertainty, and so on. Like it seems like that this version of decolonization and the respective practices this discourse entails appeared in this current form pretty late, right? If we compare them to what was like a mainstream, especially in the 90s. So we heard such words also in the 90s. But the question is whether we had to go through the revolutionary and then war experience in order to understand what is a proper intellectual tool to be applied to our own condition, as if we were deprived of our understanding and of being unconscious of ourselves for quite some time. So is there any responsibility of those, I don't know, public intellectuals or those discourses which were somehow just copy-pasted from the West without proper understanding what is the purpose for this action somehow?
Yeah. Can I answer? Yeah.
Sure,
yeah.
Please, yeah.
It's another very interesting topic. You know, when I was talking about some kind of resentment and instability, and so this is a situation. This is a situation of the 1980s that signify a kind of break with the former Soviet ideology, the kind of fathers or parents, some kind believe or disbelieve in the Soviet ideas and so on. And I would say that this period of this is not a period of stagnation; it's a period of transition. And as a period of transition, it brings some ambivalency in feeling, in finding this kind of homelessness, of otherness, of migration, I would say. And in this situation, Ukrainian, especially the young generation, they feel themselves like a person of the world. They feel they have a kind of solidarity with the other people who has not home, who has no house, who are migrant from Africa or Asia or somebody else. And for instance, Zhadan, he described very well this feeling of belonging to this kind of a new society that characterizes a globalized world. And but in this situation, this is a kind of some kind, maybe I would say, disease or something like this kind of transit mood. I don't know, but this helps to distancing from the values of the parents. And on the one hand, and on the other hand, it helps to create a new community, the community who are the same like you, for instance. And this is a community like Odnoklassnik or football team or somebody else that create a new collective memory, collective identity. And then this kind of recovering became when this generation came to Maidan. And at Maidan, it was a kind of education. It was kind of became an adult, became responsible. And so when we are talking about the generation of independence, I'm talking about this aspect of transformation from the I would call lost or last Soviet generation to absolutely new, like for instance this young men who fight on the front line and who are defender of us, like Roman Ratushny and many others like him. So it seems to me this period of transition or transit culture, I call it a transit culture, has a different stage and different movement and different archetypes, I would say, starting from teenager to loser even, and then to hero and leader. Thank you.
Well, I would add to that there is a Ukrainian intellectual tradition of thinking through the imperial experience and post-imperial experience, and it is represented by the 1920s, to some degree also by the Ukrainian parties from the period of the Ukrainian Revolution, the Social Democrats and Socialist Revolutionaries, and also to those kind of leftists who continued to exist in the early Soviet period. There's an interesting book by Stephen Velichenko, that they were the ones employing widely the notions of colonialism and empire. And of course, the cross-cultural comparisons with Ireland didn't emerge after the revolution. They were discovered by the generation of Vasyl Ukrainka, and even before that, the generation of Drahomanov. So there is an intellectual tradition there. And then, of course, in the 1960s, we encountered again in Ivan Zuba's Internationalism or Russificancia. So there is a continued trend in Ukrainian intellectual thought, which is often represented by the political forces left center or the left that engaged with the notion of empire and colonialism. So there is then something for the Ukrainian intellectuals of today to look back at. It can be argued that much of Ukrainian literature, and of course Tamara is a much greater specialist on that, is built whether implicitly or explicitly around rejecting the imperial hierarchies and imperial notions of womanhood, humanity, community. So there's quite a bit actually there, and I'm sort of waiting for the moment when decolonization in Ukraine would come complete with the recovery of this intellectual tradition. Because of course, Drahomanov was also the first person to create the map of Ukrainian ethno-linguistic territories, which is very often forgotten, or rather to introduce it to the European audience based on the pre-existing research in the 1870s already. So these traditions, they do intertwine in a variety of ways, Ukrainian anti-colonialism and the Ukrainian political tradition, and there is quite a bit of very interesting past there which needs to be recovered.
Yeah, that's a very interesting observation, really. But we are just running out of time. If I may, just the last, perhaps short question, because I think it, just to pick up where you, Serhy, left it a moment ago, because as we know, especially, I mean, I'm also struggling myself with this, especially under the warfare conditions. We, of course, understand this discourse of heroes and heroization, which basically first emerged during Maidan times, and then it was sort of continued in a bit different, perhaps, form in the warfare. But I think it's pretty obvious that pretty often this discourse is being accompanied with the discourse of victimhood or victimization, right? And somehow it's not by occasion that it is exactly these victimhood references that shaped to a great extent the practices and discourses of so-called decommunization campaign, right? So in this sense, I am rather wondering, and just because you mentioned the 20s and the 60s, and also like what Tamara was describing about the 90s, what kind of perhaps intellectual tools or instruments we can think of that would be important to employ and constantly somehow even promote in the public sphere, in order to not to fall victim to this victimhood idea, which is basically very much about in a way depriving ourselves of our own responsibility, right? And also trying to search for some moral clarity in the past that actually has never existed in this form as we imagine it today. So maybe you have some kind of it's not about recipes, but some kind of modes of thinking, or like concepts, or really notions that are really important to be spread as much as possible, especially today in the public Ukrainian sphere and elsewhere, in order to have a possibility later on. I'm even not here mentioning the words like left or left center and so on, right? Though I would like to, but anyway, so in order to have this opportunity to refer to those, for instance, socialist experience of our own Ukrainian past, right? That could be easily wiped out just because we are only following this strict, straightforward path of decommunization, no matter what, in a way. What would you suggest? What would be your intellectual advice in this regard? It's also a very personal question for me, of course.
Serhy, do you want to answer?
I do have an answer, not because I have answers to all questions, but because this is something I have been thinking about in relation to one of the books I have been working on for whatever, too long now. But there is a very well represented and well understood concept in Ukrainian culture which can be recruited for this purpose. And that concept is malorossiystvo, Little Russianism. It is widely accepted by the entire political spectrum. The right, center, and the right love it just as much as the historians and literary scholars do. And what then remains is to explain that that moment of transitioning from Little Russianism to a Ukrainian identity, the moment of Lesya Ukrainka, roughly speaking, right? Because it became popularized now in public sphere after 150th anniversary of Lesya Ukrainka, the moment when people stop being Little Russians and become Ukrainians and speak Ukrainian in everyday life and such. That moment of authenticity, like we know that authenticity is a project rather than aim, right? But in this particular case, we can borrow from the existing repertoire of political and cultural language, vocabulary in Ukraine, which is accepted by various political stripes, and revive it and explain through the comparison what was going on in 1917, the debate between Ivan Ogienko and Volodymyr Naumenko about the meaning, the importance of Ukrainian language, the Russian language, that these debates are basically the equivalent of what we are going through now. When, again, Ukrainians of all political stripes are recovering the importance of speaking Ukrainian as a matter of principle, as defining our position regardless of our political preferences. So I have used this strategy once now when speaking, and I will be using it in one of the future books, that this notion of kind of injured Ukrainian identity, the Little Russian one, which is forever politically limited and culturally deficient, is actually something we are overcoming now. And that works as an instrument because you can recruit all kinds of, you can start reading Malanyuk and that endears you immediately to the people kind of to the right center. And Malanyuk was very smart, actually. Like some things, of course, are peculiar to his political orientation, but others are quite powerful and they fit very nicely with the present day. And then, of course, there is also the Ukrainian left. There is Shumsky, the former Minister of Education, who writes in prison a large treatise, or so he claimed, because the treatise was never recovered, never found, the treatise on Little Russianism. And he says, Nikita Khrushchev and his policies in Ukraine, they are not Ukrainian policies, they are Little Russian policies. So there is a kind of the left and the right converge on the notion of this injured, deficient Ukrainian identity, which was so good for the empires. So that's, for the moment, my strategy for dealing with it. But I'm not saying it's a universal recipe.
Yeah. May I, do we have a time? I just would like to.
Yeah, please go ahead. Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Just a few sentences. When we, it is, I would say that we are absolutely right that we are talking today about heroization, about heroism, because we have a special situation. It's a situation which is a real war that we have now. So in a state of defense, we have to celebrate, and we celebrate the heroes who defend us. But it seems to me there's some kind of illness of victimization that we have for many years and maybe centuries as well. It seems to be I hope that we could not afraid of this, because during the last 30 years, we have a very interesting process in Ukraine that concerns the development of social society. So we have in Ukraine, we have this a new structure that help us to understand and to behave like individual, responsible for our action, and conscious, who are not feel any kind of другосортности, меншовартости. And we have such and maybe the phenomenon that can give me a chance to speak about this is a phenomenon of volontaire, who was born, this phenomenon was born during the Maidan, and now we can see that this the volontaire is a part of this that was created by the process of development of social society, and they have civil society, sorry, and they are so active. They are part of this war against our enemy. So it seems to me it's a kind of zapobieżnik of the possibility of any victimization.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, very, very grateful to you, Tamara, and you, Serhy, for these insightful thoughts and inputs that you made. Thank you so much also to our audience. I also invite you to join us tomorrow, the same time. We will be discussing the phenomenon of apathy in authoritarianism with Renata Salecl. And also very thankful to our colleagues from Warsaw Biennial, Dorian, Joanna, thank you so much. Thanks so much again for joining us today, Tamara and Serhy. Yeah, I wish everybody a pleasant evening and a peaceful sky. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow.
Thank you.
See you. Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.